Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space. Before we dive into this episode, I would like to take a moment to share something important with all of you. Over the past several months, this podcast has been a passion project of mine, where I have had the privilege of hosting conversations with some of the brightest minds out there, and I intend to keep doing exactly that. This podcast is all about digging into the ideas shaping our world, whether it's the future of AI, political polarization, or how we make sense of massive, important cultural shifts. But as much as I love doing this podcast, producing this type of quality content does take time, resources, and effort. And that is where you come in if you would be interested in doing so. You see, I've recently launched a Patreon for Frames of Space. And if you enjoy the show and want to help it continue to grow and thrive, I would be very grateful for your support. Even a small contribution makes a huge difference in helping me to bring on top-tier guests, improve the production quality, and keep this show sustainable in the long term. As a Patreon supporter, you will get access to exclusive updates, bonus deleted content from episodes, behind-the-scenes insights, and even opportunities to ask me some questions during live Q&A sessions. I also plan to iterate and add more rewards for my Patreon listeners as the next few months go by. So I'll check back in with all of you and make sure to let you know when I have an even more wide-reaching and extensive list of rewards for Patreon members. So if you've gotten value from the conversations we've had here, I will make sure to provide a link to my Patreon in the show notes so that you can consider becoming a subscriber. Every single contribution, big or small, does make a real difference. Thank you so much for listening. And now, onto the episode. Today, I've got an episode for all of you about a topic that rarely makes front page news, but will shape our world in important ways for generations to come, which is the problem of declining fertility rates. Now, you've probably heard bits and pieces of the ways that birth rates have been falling around the world, well below the replacement level, but I think it would be important to provide some statistics to give us more of an understanding of the magnitude of the situation. Now, let's look at the scientific publication Our World in Data, for example. If we were to look back in 1973, the average birth rate for the world at large was 4.4. 50 years later in 2023, it was just 2.3, just barely above replacement level. And it's much, much worse for upper middle income countries as well. Back in 1973, the average birth rate was something like 4.5, and now 50 years later, it's fallen all the way to 1.5, meaning that the population is going to start declining pretty rapidly and pretty quickly. Now that is a trend with some serious consequences, not just for the size of future populations, which it will definitely affect, but also for the ways that entire societies function. Everything from how we design our schools to how we design our retirement programs and how we prioritize values like education and family, all of that is affected by the problem of declining fertility. But is there something deeper going on behind those statistics? My guest today is Robin Hanson, an economist at George Mason University, and he definitely thinks so. He thinks that there's something deeper going on, and that the falling birth rates that we see around the world are just a symptom of a much, much broader problem that he calls cultural drift. Now, he explains this a lot more in our podcast, but I think one thing to keep in mind is just an understanding of how Many of the social norms and values that we used to take for granted have been changing rapidly. Let's take, for instance, the way that men and women date each other, who makes the first move, how they fall in love, how courtship works. That's all tremendously changed over the past few decades. Norms around how much education people are expected to have and how high of a college degree you need in order to make your way through society. That's another example of a societal norm that has changed in such a stark way over the past few decades. And maybe these norms have been changing faster than any traditional forces have time to catch up with. Or at least that's Robin's thesis in this conversation. Robin lays out what cultural drift is and why it might be eroding the core institutions and habits that once kept birth rates stable. If you enjoy conversations that test your understanding of what counts as normal, then this episode is for you because it goes straight into the heart of some pretty fundamental questions about our society, its trajectory, and whether we've been losing more than we realize as culture has continued to shift over time. I hope you find it as fascinating as I did. Now let's get started. Robin Hanson, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Nice to meet you, Andrew, again.
Yeah. So my first question is pretty simple. What made you decide to become an economist?
Um, well, I had a long intellectual journey. Started out in engineering, then went to physics, then went off to Silicon Valley to do AI and hypertext publishing. And on the side, I had a hobby eventually of doing institution design, and I decided to try to make that a career. So I had these ideas for how to change the world, different institutional structures, and that seemed just really promising. So after 9 years out of school at doing research in Silicon Valley, I returned to school at Caltech in 1993.
Do you think so you dabbled a little bit in engineering and physics and AI in Silicon Valley. Do you think any of those experiences affected the way that you view economics relative to other economists?
Well, most economists haven't been in other fields. So I would think I'm just more like a polymath sort of person, a person who has many kinds of expertise and can combine them and compare them, et cetera. And then most intellectuals aren't that general. They haven't done a lot of different topics. So I'll bring to economics the same sort of generality and ability to compare that I would bring to other topics. I probably more specifically, I spent a lot of time in physics initially, and I didn't realize it at the time, but physicists believe their theories in a way that other academics don't.
They know it to be true.
Well, I don't know that they know it, but they believe it. That is, it's not just a useful structure, fiction, way of organizing the data, way of thinking about things.
It's not
It's
something where like if
reality.
yeah, like for like maybe economics is a field where like if you have a theory, you could hedge it a little bit and like squint sideways until you get to the point where you get closer to believing it to be true.
Well, even believing it isn't the same thing. You believe it as an organizing framework or something. You believe it as a, thing that explains some correlations, the thing that's like true in some sense, but it's a somewhat of an abstract sense. And physicists believe their physical theories to just be literally exactly what the world is. Now, they think they might be wrong. It's not that they're absolutely certain, but the thing they believe, they think it's a very specific, concrete thing. And if it's true, that's the way the universe is, and there isn't anything else in the universe but that. And that's just a very different attitude I've discovered. Uh, and so it sets a high bar. That is, you want to find theories not only that you think you can organize things with, but that are literally true.
Yeah, so I want to get to some of the theories that you yourself are known for, but I guess first a bit of just like an Econ 101 question to fill in our audience that might not know. What is the difference between a normative statement and an empirical one?
Um, well, uh, our standard decision theory says that your uh, decisions are based on probabilities and utilities, and probabilities are about what is the arrangement of stuff and what affects what actions would have on the world, and utility is about which of those you like more than others. So normative statements, in some broadest sense, are about what you prefer.
Yeah, like what you think is like good for society, like from a moral point of view, you would.
Well, that's one kind of preference, but there are many, kinds of ways to prefer. But we often, among our various contributions to our preferences, we do tend to distinguish morality as one of them. Uh, and it's a supposedly shared thing that we have in common. Uh, but people are somewhat ambiguous about how much of your preferences is encompassed by morality. That is it
Yeah.
merely a constraint? Is it a modest weight? Is it everything?
Yeah.
We don't have to decide that here.
But like the idea that someone should not be beaten, like some random person on the street should not be beaten to death with an axe, that's like a normative statement.
Well, the word should is a clue there.
Yeah.
What you mean is that we have collectively, you know, agreed that we together disapprove of that and will act on that disapproval in various ways when we coordinate. If once we figure out we believe it's true, and which of our jurisdictions for settling such things will be applied, etc. But yes, it's,
Yes.
we might dislike it and know that we all dislike it together and then be willing together to do things about it.
Yeah. Um, so I guess part of the reason why I got you on is because you're known for quite an interesting thesis known as cultural drift. So what is cultural drift? How would you describe cultural drift in your words? And feel free to take as long as you want.
Sure. I'll probably just do short and let you ask questions so that we can keep this more conversational. But fundamentally, the thing that makes humans different from the other animals is culture. And what that literally means is we have this capacity to copy behavior from each other instead of just inheriting behavior in our DNA from our, parents, grandparents, etc. And that ability to copy behavior from each other means that our collective behavior collectively can evolve very fast, much faster than even generations of us. And that's been our superpower. Um, it's a process analogous to DNA, but it's much more recent. It's much faster, but it's much cruder. DNA systems have had billions of years to evolve really elaborate systems. So whenever you have some feeling pushed by DNA, like you're getting cold or you're getting hungry, getting tired, um, you can be pretty sure that that system is accounting for a lot of context. And it's pretty sophisticated. And whatever sort of biases it might have, there's counter things in there that'll try to fix that because it's a really old evolved system. This culture thing's brand new and it doesn't have all that elaborate checks and balances. It's very simple, basically Darwinian selection. Some people do things one way, other people do things another way, and then some win, some lose. And in the end, there's more of the ones who do it a better way than the ones who did it the worst way.
You say some win, some lose. Explain that a little bit.
Well, in a natural selection context, it's win in the sense of having more descendants and causing more of the future, basically, to be like you through having more descendants in various ways.
Yeah, so the
Uh,
people that win, either they're able to like give birth to more people, or they're able to like successfully kill more of the people that are part of the other cultural group. Is that what you're
or
saying?
just get the other people to copy their culture. In
Yeah.
cultural evolution, that's still a win.
Yeah, so like the yeah, like the Federation in Star Trek. Um, yeah.
Sure. Right. But so the key idea here is that this cultural evolution process is very fast, but it's very basic. And it has two levels. One is the level of things that it's relatively easy to vary individually, like, say, how you fish. And so, people who fish better will get more fish and survive better. And then people who copy the people who fish better. And then we'll evolve various ways to figure out who to copy. One of them might be who catches more fish. And that's very powerful. And it's been increasingly fast and powerful. And it's driving our huge, in growth in the last few centuries of wealth and technology, business practices, etc. by all this detailed watching each other and seeing who's doing better by various metrics and copying the winners.
Yeah.
That's one level, and we're doing great by that level. But there's another level. It's analogous to, say, biological species. So in ordinary biology, there are these units of species, and there are things that can change within a species, like how long your claw is, for example, or how big your lungs are. And those things evolve within a species. And then the bigger a species is, the faster those things can evolve because there are more different places in a species that can invent something that would spread to the rest of the species. But then there are features in a species that are tied to the species. And in order to evolve those, you just need to have different species. And two species, supposedly can't mate and produce other outcomes. So basically, you can't spread these innovation within a species because they define the whole species, and you're just going to have new species to do these kind of innovations. Analogously, in culture, there are cultural units of a culture, which is people who kind of have to behave pretty similarly, at least according to certain aspects, because of those features are very important to the culture, and there's norms against violating cultural practices, and that then defines a culture. And then, in order to have evolution of cultures, we need many cultures.
Yeah.
Whereas evolution of the features that can vary within a culture, just having one huge culture works great. And in fact, that's kind of what's been happening in the last few centuries. We've been having many fewer cultures and much less selection of cultures, which has made the evolution of stuff that can vary within a culture go fast and great and wonderful. Uh, but the problem is, if you have fewer cultures and they hardly ever die, and they hardly ever take each other over, then you're going to have much weaker selection of cultures. And that's the problem I'm worried about, that we have sort of turned off selection of cultures, even though we have great selection within cultures.
We have turned off selection of cultures, even if we have selection within cultures. So that's very interesting. Could you provide some examples, like some tangible examples of times in the past where there were certain like traits that people had that they had to deliberately suppress or like choose not to talk about or externalize in order to fit into that culture, either in an explicit way or in an implicit way?
Well, for example, most cultures have norms about mating. When in your life you mate, what sort of partners you should pick, what you do with mates compared to other people, and those are enforced by norms. That is, it's hard for you to deviate and have a very different priority of what you want in a mate and when you'll get when you'll mate and who you'll pick, what the constraints are on mating all by yourself, uh, because your partner needs to coordinate with you on these things, and the world around you has rules that they will enforce on you about these things. And so that's a sort of thing that cultures have to change together.
Yeah.
And that's for one example. Another example, might be leadership. What counts as a leader? Who's eligible for leadership? What are the obligations of a leader? And again, cultures, it's hard to deviate. It's hard to just a person to just be a different kind of leader in a society that isn't looking for that kind of leader or selecting them or judging them um, on different criteria.
Yeah, so maybe to give like a very overt example, would it be like how women were discouraged from leadership like 100 years ago or even like 50 years
Well,
ago?
right, certainly one of the norms are that leaders have certain kind of features, and they tended to match more with stereotypic male styles and features, which made it hard for
Yeah.
women to take leadership roles.
Sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But culture really has thousands of these things, and they're sometimes hard to see until you go looking for them. So we all tend to think that we're mostly free to do what we want because we're mostly going along with all the, assumptions and rules of our culture. And it's only when we actually violate them that we start to notice they're there.
Yeah, like we're free to do what we want within like a very specific framework that we usually don't
Right.
question because if we question them too much,
Right.
then like the best case like the worst case scenario would be that we would get shunned by our culture and it would cause a measurable amount of consequences. And the best case scenario would be that we don't get suffer a measurable harm from our culture, but we still suffer like decision fatigue or decision paralysis. And it ends up making it harder for us to make decisions in the future because we have less of a frame of reference for
So
what to
I'll
do.
give a third example, which is very relevant for our culture today, which is how much education is expected among a high quality person. That is, we infer people's quality and their abilities from their level of education. And you're allowed personally to deviate. You don't have to go to school, but then you will suffer other people's looking at you and making inferences about your abilities and um, level of quality from that fact. So you're basically pressured if you want to be accepted widely as of high quality to get as much education as you can. And that's, again, a feature that of the culture, and it's hard to change that individually.
Yeah. So, do you think, like, so what are some ways that cultural selection may have affected your views or my views, or just the views of some stereotypical person in like early 2025 Western society?
Well, I came at this subject by first studying fertility. And so it was a set of correlates of fertility that seemed to be culturally driven or, you know, coming from culture that made me think about culture and how it might be evolving. That is, fertility is falling and falling a lot lately, and it's pretty widespread fall. And if you go and look for specific causes, um, what you end up finding is a bunch of cultural changes that seem to have contributed to fertility fall.
Yeah. Like I remember there was this one New York Times opinion writer, Jessica Groves, that I talked with earlier, where she did a bit of research and she concluded that the two main drivers of declining fertility rate were increased access to birth control and women becoming more educated. And like I think like you can make a very plausible case that those two are both like unambiguously good things. But that
Well,
go
I
ahead.
mean, whether we want to decide something's good or bad will take a whole infrastructure and analysis to do.
Yeah.
But
But maybe we can
we,
spend like later on in this episode, we can try
sure,
building that infrastructure so that I
right,
can start
sure,
arguing with
right.
you about this.
Okay, right. But I mean, first, we could just talk about whether they are contributing to fertility and how. And then we could talk about whether they are subject to cultural evolution and plausibly the cultural evolution processes that are involved with these changes. And that would be the context in which we could then talk about whether we like them or not.
Yeah. And like what like yeah. Um, do you want to start building that infrastructure?
Well, again, the first thing might be just notice a number of trends, more than just the two you mentioned. As far as I can tell, the birth control is actually a relatively minor contribution. That seems to be the consensus of people I've read in this area, but it also makes sense to me. But education seems to be a larger one. That is, we have a sort of standard educational tracks, and we don't very much tolerate sort of pauses. Certainly, pauses of a decade or something are not very tolerated in the educational tracks. So we hand out status in great proportion to education in our world. And education is what makes you eligible for many high status positions in our world. And we just respect people with a lot of education and these other positions that education is a requirement for. So most everyone knows that if they want to be very well respected, they should probably get as much education as they can. And that means that, you know, key years of female fertility are being spent in school by the women who don't want to give up on that hope of those that, you know, rise in status and achieving those things. A related other norm, though, is that not only is it hard to sort of pause or slow down your education and like have children and go to school, say at the same time, we we mostly disapprove of people having children before they're married, and we've acquired a norm in the last half century or so of what we often call a capstone marriage as opposed to cornerstone marriage. So I'm 65, I got married a long time ago, And when I got married, you could say the norm was more the cornerstone marriage concept, i.e., two people get married when they're both relatively young, relatively immature, not fully formed, not really knowing where exactly they're going to go in life. And they just pair up and work those things out together. And now there's more of a norm that you should get your act together, be a mature person, figure out your place in the world, and have some sort of career security, and then get married and have kids. And it just takes a lot longer to achieve that. And that's another cultural change. Um, in addition, of course, an older change is that we're relatively individualistic. So our basically that if we have kids, our parents are not very involved. They're not there taking care of the kids. We're not living with them. They're not, basically helping us run everything as traditional societies did. And partly traditional societies also helped us pick out our mates and helped overcome some of the problems of immature people picking mates because they weren't making the full choice. And that's again something that's, if you're making the choice by yourself and having to do it yourself, then it's a bigger ask to have kids when you're young. And more things can go wrong, of course, if you're immature and making those choices when you're young. And that's also contributing to lower fertility. Certainly, in addition, just the idea that women should be able to achieve the same kind of status markers as men is contributing here, and that they're going to the same schools and the same career paths and on the same schedule. And if, of course, if they had a different schedule or a different set of things that gave them status, then that might be more compatible with them having kids earlier.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're still talking empirically and not normatively when we
Yes, of
say that.
course, right, right. We're
Yeah.
talking about trends that have contributed to lower fertility. And then what else do we have? We have urbanity. Certainly, it seems to, at least in correlates, to be harder to have kids in dense urban areas with smaller space.
And
Religion,
more people are moving to cities, which is making
right?
and those cities are correlated with lower fertility.
Right. And smaller places in cities and fewer places for kids to play, for et cetera, right? In
Yeah.
cities. Um, and then religion is on great decline. And religion seems to be a strong correlate of fertility. And, you know, so that's a strong cultural trend, a long-term cultural trend. Um, I'm thinking there are definitely others that I'm not thinking of here, but I guess we can mention them when they come up. But
Yeah.
these
We'll
are some major ones.
we'll cross those bridges once we get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then if we ask, why are these trends happening?
Yeah, like
Um,
what happened to allow us would you say that these examples of cultural drift did they come from cultural selection or did they come elsewhere?
well, that's the key point. Many of these are features that are at the higher level I talked about, at like the species analog level, as they're not so much things that people can just do individually different. They're things that groups of people have to do together different if they're going to be done different.
They're like collective action problems.
Right. And so they're more influenced by the fact that, basically, say 3 centuries ago, the world had hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures, each with 1,000 or 2,000 people who could be pretty autonomous because they didn't interact with each other that much, really. They're mostly self-sufficient.
And most of them had no idea what was going on the other side of the
Right,
world.
exactly. Or even 100 miles away in the capital of their nation, was supposed. Uh, right. And then uh, they were near the edge of survival. They were poor, then there were pandemics and wars who came through. And so if they if they changed their culture to be somewhat less functional, they could easily just go away and be replaced by their neighbors. That was the world, say, 3 centuries ago, pretty much everywhere in the world. And then we've had these big changes of modernity in the last few centuries. One of the earliest was the creation of nation states. That is, nation-sized things like France smashed hundreds of local peasant cultures into a single national culture forcefully to common language, common dress, common trade rules, common marriage rules, all those sorts of things were forced. And so a great reduction of variety by the creation of nation states. And then in the last half century or so, we've had a merging of world cultures into a more world culture, especially among elites. And so there's even less variety there. And then we've had much less selection pressures in the sense that cultures just, even nations don't die much anymore.
Yeah, it's not like if you do the wrong culture thing, you're just gonna die out. It's
Right.
not like that anymore.
Exactly. So selection is way down, variety is way down. And then in addition, we have this remarkable phenomena of cultural activism and cultural change. So these peasant cultures from centuries ago, they were pretty conservative. They didn't really want to change their basic ways. And if they did, they were sort of doing it without noticing it over slow, long timescales.
They didn't need to change in the same ways that we might need to change.
Well, the question is what's the cause of our change and whether it's driven by needs. But we have rapid change not only of technology and of business practices and say military practices, but we have rapid change of things closer to values and norms that don't seem to be driven by these other things.
Yeah, like a lot of norms around, like, say, for instance, dating and like what the right way for like a man
Right?
to approach a woman and like how relationships are supposed to work and who, like how to
Right.
allocate
And
responsibility.
and some of that is driven by technology and wealth, but most of it isn't. And attitudes toward family, attitudes, relative attitudes to work, to friends, to religion, to death, to your nation, patriotism, to the arts, to travel. There's a whole range of attitudes there that have changed a lot. And most of that change doesn't seem to be driven by, say, the particular technology needs or particular business practice needs. Some of it might be. So even, for example, education, you might think, well, education was driven by modern economy needing more educated workers. But in fact, most education is not. It's mostly signaling, not actually useful training. And so that's more of a cultural change that wasn't driven, although it's often excused as if it was driven by technology and business practices.
So
So, so
go
there's
ahead.
changing fast. And so we need to ask why. And is it driven by selection? That's from the cultural evolution point, that is the key question. So if we go back to DNA, a lot of ways that animals change behavior is encoded in DNA that was selected before. So animals change behavior time of day, season of the year, whether they're in the water or on land, whether they're older or younger, right? Animal behavior changes enormously by context, but that's mostly due to evolved habits by which the behavior will change by context. And those habits aren't changing very fast. Those are very slow habits, even though the animals can change greatly if they're in a desert, in a forest, in a river, right? Their behavior will just change enormously, but that's not driven directly by selection in the term and the moment. It's driven by selection long ago for animals that have different habits, and then they, act out those habits. So if our change of norms and values was being driven in that way, then it could be, the result of selection. It would have been the result long ago of selection of habits of change that were adapted to kinds of changes that might show up. Um, but it just doesn't look like that. That is, many of the changes we're seeing are just changes nobody ever saw before.
Give me
And
s- Give me some
go ahead.
examples. Give me some examples of changes we're seeing that we've never seen before, and we know that they're not an example of cultural selection.
Well, nobody ever got educated as much as people are being educated today. That wasn't a thing. Um, people basically didn't live as long as we live today. So they really couldn't have had adaptations for what to do when you're 80 years old. Nobody ever, there was just not a substantial portion of people living to be 80 back then. You certainly couldn't have had norms about how to deal with cars. Never had cars or airplanes or nuclear power or, nuclear weapons. And, all of our behavior with respect to novel technology can't have been evolved in much detail with respect to those technologies. Would have to be mapping on sort of very high level descriptions there had to have been something in the past that met that high level description, and then we're applying that heuristic to this new context. Um,
Yeah. There's one term that you use in your commentary that I think is kind of interesting, which is the idea of adaptive or maladaptive traits. Could you go over that a little bit?
So that's just another way to refer to this idea that it's very simple, basic natural selection going on, nothing that complicated. So remember, with DNA, it's undergoing natural selection, but it's had all this time to build up all of these complicated, subtle mechanisms to to deal with very common variations that the organisms will experience, like more water, more sunlight, dark, cold, etc. And so there's all this way in which behavior changes by context that's adaptive, i.e., promoting long-term natural selection. As natural selection selects for things that will succeed in future selection, right? That's the idea. And so adaptive just means won't be selected out.
Yeah, adaptive means that like from like a biological perspective, like evolution and natural selection will not render it obsolete.
Right. I mean, but you don't need the word from biological perspective. So that's just literally, biology is this world of creatures who exist now because their ancestors didn't get selected out. And that's what you see. And that's what we are. We are creatures of natural selection, but we have this new cultural part. And that's the different part, but it's not escaping natural selection. Culture is very much under the power of natural selection, but it's a new way of inheritance. It's a new way of inheriting behaviors and traits. And so it's powerful in terms of its speed, but it's like sports cars are often break easy. Like a basic ordinary family car, it doesn't go so fast, but it's very robust because that's what it's selected for. People just want a car they can beat up and not do much with, and it still keeps working. And people want a performance sports car. They make all these very clever, designs, but they break easy because they aren't designed to be robust. And that's kind of what humans are with this culture. It's a sports car. It goes much faster, but it's new and not doesn't have all the little robustness tweaks of other DNA to make sure things can handle lots of variation.
Yeah, so if adaptive cultural traits are just cultural traits that survive under natural selection, then maybe a maladaptive trait is something that didn't come from cultural selection, like the fact that everyone's becoming so much more educated in the past. Would you consider that to be a maladaptive cultural trait?
Well, so a trait would be a tendency, maybe, which is might be different than a current, situation.
So
So,
maybe everyone becoming more educated, that's a maladaptive situation.
right, that is, if it was competing with some other culture that people didn't get as much education, the other culture might win.
Because like the fact that they're less educated, there's a correlation and possibly causation between that and like higher fertility rates.
Well, not just higher fertility, but higher many other things. If basically we spend all these years getting educated that isn't actually productive, we're not actually learning much, we're just sorting ourselves, then the question is, how much value is that sorting giving us compared to doing other things and sorting through other ways? But yes, so maladapt maladaptive is just basically not causally leading to future things being like you.
Do you,
Not having
yeah.
descendants of all sorts. That's literally what maladaptive is, a thing that we predict will not have as many descendants.
Do you want to start building a framework to understand these concepts from a normative point of view?
So I mean, the simplest argument, and you should push back if you don't like it, is just that whatever normative goals you have, um, you'll have to consider that either the causal process that leads to the future, first, do you care about the future or only at the moment, right?
Wait,
So,
yeah, the causal process that leads to the future, simplify that for like a little bit. Yeah.
right. I mean, well, first of all, I need you to care about the future. So if you say, I only care about the present, I only care about my life right now, well, then I won't have as many arguments I can bring to bear as if you care about other people and the future
Yeah.
in your normative analysis. So I'm going to presume you care about the future and that you not only want whatever you like to exist now in your life and in the world around you, but also to continue to exist in the future. That's, if I can make that assumption, then I can say to you, look, the process that led to you was this natural selection process. Either that process continues into the future, in which case, the future stuff will only be like you to the extent that it's adaptive, because that's what adaptive means, or you'll have to replace this cultural evolution process with some other process that causes future things. And then you want to control that process to some degree to make future things like you. If you have something you want in the future, some features of the future that you have in mind that your normative preferences say, this is what I want the future to be like. Your question is, how will I cause the future to be like that? I will either accept natural selection continuing and then work with it somehow to cause the future to be what I wanted, or I will have to replace natural selection with some other process and then make that process cause the future to be how I want it.
Do you believe that cultural drift is an inherently bad thing because natural selection will eventually erase those tendencies?
So, for example, at the moment, we actually face competitors who are really existing in our world.
Who is we and who are the competitors?
So, you and I are part of this mainstream world culture, and most of the world is sort of sucked into it, up into it by now, but the richest countries are most sucked in, and the elites of the richest countries all the more so. And I'll assume you and I represent them. So we are more associated with the elites of the richest countries. And so we are definitely more than most immersed in the shared world culture. And to the extent that this shared world culture is becoming maladaptive, then we predict it'll be more vulnerable to challenges by alternatives. Now, if the entire world is mixed up with our shared thing, then even though we're declining, it's all declining with us. And so we aren't actually threatened yet by something displacing us because we're all maladaptive together. But if offshoots can arise that defy the shared world culture and then make more adaptive choices, then the prediction is that they will win in the long run. And so if we want to influence the future, we have to figure out how to influence them or how to make us fail less. Those are the two basic routes to influence. So a metaphor I like to give is you're on a ship heading for an iceberg. Your choices are to, to gain control of the whole ship and move the whole ship or get off on lifeboats. Those are the options. And that's the only way to influence, future past the iceberg descendants who are still around to do things.
So, like, running into the iceberg would be maladaptive, like adopting more maladaptive aspects of the
Right.
culture.
If our main world culture is going to basically decline over the coming centuries and then be displaced or replaced by alternative cultures, the question is, which path do you want to influence the future?
Do you think Social Security is an example of maladaptive culture? Because we are providing money to like retired old people, where if like from a purely utilitarian calculus, they would not be able to provide as much output to society.
Um, basically, excess retirement benefits are more plausibly maladaptive. Then you could decide how to set the optimal level. I wouldn't say that zero retirements are optimal, but I might say the optimal level is less than we have now. That would be a more plausible claim. For example, even more plausible is that we now have typically around the world women retire at a younger age than men, even though women live to be older ages. So we are certainly losing out on more years of women's potential work.
Um, I think I'm gonna get back to this later because I have one thought-provoking question that might be pushed back to you, but it would require more infrastructure, so I'm gonna keep building the infrastructure.
Okay.
Do you think so? Do you believe that in general, cultural drift is an inherently bad thing because it leads to more maladaptive cultural like elements within society that will end up losing to natural selection?
I I want to put it carefully because I don't want to get stuck in extremes. And I want to stake out an intermediate position and make claims with respect to an intermediate position. So my intermediate position is whatever else you wanted to influence the future to be like, you will either have to replace or accommodate natural selection in promoting what you want to promote.
So theoretically, we could encourage maladaptive aspects of the culture if there was some way that we could transcend natural selection.
Right. Some way you could turn off the what would otherwise the way natural selection would punish those things and prevent them from being an influence on the future. But if we assume natural selection will continue, then we have to then maladaptive things will go be reduced in their size and influence. And so whenever you tie yourself to something maladaptive, that's a cost. Any of the other things that you were trying to promote, you're having less influence on because these maladaptive parts are causing a decline in your influence.
Yeah. But so let's say that you're you making the qualified claim that we should generally discourage maladaptive traits because of natural
All
selection.
else equal, right? But there
Oh.
might be particular exceptions where you're willing to pay a high price maladaption because something else you care so much about.
Do you believe in any of those exceptions? Are there any maladaptive aspects of the culture where you personally strongly believe in them because of the normative good that they provide to society?
I mean, I can look among the features of my cultures that I most cherish, and then I can say, I, I'm going to be willing to pay a high price to save those, but I don't know how high a price I'll actually have to pay unless I can figure out that they're actually maladaptive. So that's something I'm, you know, open to being convinced of, but not sure of. So I'm an intellectual, and I very much cherish there being a space in the world for intellectuals who try to figure out abstract truth and
Yeah.
tell each other about them. And that's
Regardless of whether that's utility maximizing from a cultural selection point of view.
right. I mean, there are ways in which it has benefited our society, but I can now also see costs. And
Yeah.
so I am not sure about how large those costs are. So one fact about the world is that in pretty much all previous cultures, intellectuals were what they called esoteric. They hid what they really said to each other when they talked to the public, and they talked to the public in, you know, mystical, vague,
Yeah.
ways compatible with the dogma of their world.
And
And,
sometimes they spouted BS.
right. To the outside world, but tried to tell each other privately that, that was BS. So we're in an unusual culture historically where many of us intellectuals figure out disturbing truths and just say them directly to the world. And
Yeah,
I
like
can't be
what you're
sure
doing
that will
right now.
last. Right, right. And I
Yeah, what
can't be
like
sure that will last.
yeah.
I can't, I don't know how adaptive that is. I'll have to just admit, I'm not sure how adaptive that is, but it's something I care a lot about. So I might be willing to sacrifice many other kinds of things that our culture cherishes if I could save that.
Yeah. Just like how maybe someone might cherish greater levels of social security, even if it might be maladaptive because
They
of how
might,
much, yeah. And maybe that might be just as much, if not more, valid of a point of view than what you're doing in terms of your point of view about how the certain aspects of
right? But
academia that are maladaptive.
right, but I can stand back and switch to the, causal analysis and just say, what is the distribution of people's degree of attachment to the various features of their culture, and use that to predict how fast the culture will decline. Because the key question is, will they be willing to make enough sacrifices to save the culture or not? That's a key question about our macroculture is will we find a way to save it, basically? Because a fertility constraint is a very, sharp thing. Either you have above replacement fertility or you don't. If you have below replacement fertility, it's just a matter of how slowly you decline, but you do keep declining.
And increased levels of education end up decreasing people's fertility rates.
That's one of the, contributing factors. Yes. And so again, the basic argument is you are an evolved creature. That's how most of your features were created. Unless you can somehow, defy your origin and the system that made you and make a whole new system that causes the future to evolve, you'll have to accept that the system that made you is going to continue to make the world and you will have to accommodate it or go away.
Do you think that we should entertain the idea that we should educate people less in order to increase fertility rates?
Yes.
You're doing like exactly what you said like earlier. If there's like some really hard truth in the past, people would just like spout BS instead. And now instead you're just like directly saying, "Oh, I think we should educate people less
Right.
to
Well,
avoid cultural."
I'm in a culture that tolerates this, and this is a key issue about whether we will save this culture. That is, unfortunately, I think the odds are against this, and so I'm kind of desperate to see if I can convince people there's a problem and motivate people to do something about it, because otherwise, the default is that we will decline and be replaced.
If you think we should educate people less, like what specific groups, like which humans do you think in general we should educate less?
Well, what I try to do is to ask what function is education serving in society and find something else to serve that function at a lower cost. So I actually think the
And like
key,
the function in your mind is just to like make more like babies so that society can
no, no,
reproduce. And like,
this is more specific. What is the function of education in society? What role is it playing?
okay.
And so there I'd say what we might rather do is have, instead of people going to college, going to some internships where they learned on a job and they were more productive. But I think the problem with that is that internships aren't standardized enough today. That is, if somebody went to University of Cincinnati and got a B plus in engineering, people think they know what that means, and they think they know how to compare that to other people. And that's the power of college, is that its branding and evaluation are seen to be comparable across a wide scope of different colleges and majors and places. Um, and that's just not true for internships, unfortunately. Uh, if somebody said they went to Google and got an internship in this division and they got an evaluator who says he was pretty good, people just don't feel they know what that means as a way to compare that to other people or to compare that to a college student. So I would like to get places that would do internships to coordinate better to make more comparable ratings of their interns. And then it could more plausibly compete with college. And then we wouldn't be wasting as much time in college because we would be learning on the job.
So I'm gonna repeat the question. Under your like proposed idea, who would end up getting educated less?
Well, the people that we could convince to do internships instead. And then that would hopefully be most everybody except the people who are actually learning something useful in college or that's actually relevant for their career, which is relative is a minority.
Do
So,
you, it's very specific STEM fields?
right, or say nursing or, particular professions, even law, like there are, it's more plausible that what you learn useful things in school for professional preparation than you do for general preparation, and more plausible for STEM than elsewhere. But honestly, it could be an awful lot of STEM also just doesn't need to go to college.
Okay, so like which demographics do you think would end up getting educated less under your proposed idea of what we should do?
Um, well, it would be the younger people if it happened at a certain moment in time. There would be people after that time for whom it would happen than before the time. That's one concept of demographic. Another concept of demographic might be, I don't know, socioeconomic status, i.e., income or ability. And so I would expect that there, are many people as a college teacher, I can tell you, who aren't actually learning that much in college because it's kind of over their head. And so they shouldn't be at college. But again, I don't have very specific opinions on answers to this, nor do I think I need them. I'm more of a person who wants to design better institutions and let, things settle where they are with the institution. I would just trust a better institution and whatever consequences it has about the demographics.
Yeah, and like you're not sure about what they are, you just strongly
I don't,
believe that whatever they are, it is going to lead to people being less educated.
right, right. So as an economist, I think we should focus on institutions and choose more efficient institutions. And we're not necessarily sure about who exactly is going to have which consequences when we change an institution, say by gender, by age, by ethnicity. Those are not things easy to predict by just changing an institution. And I think we should just change the institution and make it better and see what happens.
Yeah, and like that might lead to like men getting less educated, that might lead to women getting less
right?
educated,
Don't know.
etc. Yeah. But like whichever option it is, like you would generally stand by your decision.
Right now, if we're thinking of specific institutional fixes, and we're thinking about the fertility problem. I have a more specific fix, which is that basically, in the West today, we have huge levels of government debt, and that means it's worth a lot to the government for each new child because every new child is, in fact, saddled with the average amount of government debt. And at the moment in the United States, say that's plausibly $300,000, in which case it's worth $300,000 to the government for each new child born, in which case it's worth paying parents something of that order to have children be born. And now I actually propose a way that makes quality work better in the sense of I would give parents a transferable percentage of their future children's tax payments, which they could sell to pay for parenting. Uh, but the point is then, if we did that, then there'd be this way to make a lot of money, which is to have kids, and that would induce a lot of people to switch their life plans to early on have a bunch of kids to get this money. And that plausibly also would change who went to college. That interacts there, you see. Now it's not just losing out on your years of income by going to college. You're losing out on this great opportunity to have kids and be paid a lot for that.
Yeah, so like you're proposing like a metaphorical carrot where you want people to drop out of like attending university so that they can have kids and make a lot of money that way.
Right. And then,
Okay.
maybe universities would adapt to letting them come back 10 years later if they were rich enough to pay for it because they had made all this money having kids earlier.
Yeah. Um, all right. Now I want to focus a little bit more on the normative side. Like what determines whether something is good or bad? Like what is your like interpretation for how we know that Nazis are evil, for example?
I will actually say that most of your values about such things came from culture. So this is not a separate discussion. You think that you know what's good or bad, primarily because you learned that from your culture. And people in other times and places learn different things about what's good or bad
We learn what's good or bad from what our teachers tell us in school or like the messaging of like the TV shows that we grow up with
on
or
your
whatever.
parents, etc. Yes,
Yeah.
that's where you got these ideas. And so, unfortunately, the prediction is that people will apply the normative standards of their culture when they evaluate culture. And that means they mostly like the culture they're in and think it was great that the past changed to be what they have, and then not so sure it's so great for it to change after them.
Do you believe in moral relativism? Like, do you think that morality is like subjective?
I'm not very sure um, what morality is other than evolved habits of shared norms um, for social groups to coordinate on what behaviors they want to reward, discourage, and encourage. Um, that seems to be its social function, its evolved function. I'm not sure there is a truth to the matter of what should sit into that slot. I can see that it was caused by, first DNA evolution, making social groups need to have some ways of coordinating to, reward good behavior and discourage bad behavior in a social group. And that cultural evolution has taken that up and made many changes to what we consider moral. And I'm not sure what I would use to anchor the concept of what's really moral once I realized that my concepts of morality and everyone else's came from this causal process that we can trace back as the evolutionary process that produced these moral feelings.
Yeah, so like you would say you're not sure that there is some like hard truth of the matter beyond just people being incentivized to act in a certain way depending on their
Well, it's not
society.
just incentivized. That is, you you have it built inside you. That is, you have these strong feelings of what's moral based on, again, your parents and your teachers and your TV shows. And you will act on those even against incentives that you now face because you feel so strongly about them. So
Do
it's
you th-
not just the incentives you face now, it's the causal process that produced you now having them.
Do you think that your interpretation of this sort of thing can very easily be used for people to evade responsibility when they commit like bad actions?
Um, every community, every society has its shared moral and other legal norms and social norms, and it enforces those. And to some degree, it doesn't need to enforce them as strongly when people voluntarily obey because they have already built them inside themselves. So,
Yeah. You could like they were quote unquote indoctrinated, whatever.
right. So, to the extent I tell people that this is how it happened, that might make people less internally inclined to obey them, but they would still obey them to the degree that there are social rules and enforcement of them. But yes, I have to accept that telling people that their values are culturally encoded will cause them to question those values a bit and therefore less naturally obey them than they otherwise would. That's a hard
Maybe,
truth. I got to admit.
yeah. But like theoretically, if there were authoritarian or anti-democratic forces on the rise, it would be easier to like downplay them or downplay the responsibility that any individual has in stopping them, because of the way that they see morality as just the product of the way that people were raised.
Well, that would depend on whether they liked or disliked these authoritarians. They could go either way. So if they happen to like them, they would find it easier to accept them. If they happen to dislike them, they'll find it easier to distance and repress them.
Yeah. Or maybe they dislike them, but like the stuff that you're saying makes it easier for them to feel like they don't need to take a stand against them and they can just go back to like cleaning their kitchen and like watching Netflix or whatever.
Sure. So that is once you seeing the causal origins of your morality may make you embrace them less and therefore be less morally motivated to do things or not do things.
Yeah, it would decrease your level of moral conviction.
Yes.
Yeah. Um,
And that's often been an argument for not telling people the truth about such things.
yeah. And I'm guessing that you don't believe in that argument.
I mean, again, causally, I have to accept it's true. Yes, but look, the I choose what I call to people's attention or not. I wouldn't have to discuss this. So I'm thinking all of us love something about our culture, and we wouldn't like it to go away and be replaced by very different ones. So in order for us to see that we have a problem and be motivated to do something, I need to call your attention to it. So I need to point out some awkward truths about how culture works and how morality works. But the point of doing that is to try to motivate people to see a problem and do something about it.
Yeah.
And that I think if I could make people do something, that would be worth a number of costs because what's at stake here is our entire shared culture and what it represents to us.
Yeah. So what are some other like things that you think we need to do to prevent cultural drift where a lot of Western society would consider it to be highly repressive?
Um, well, there are a number of possible routes by which we might prevent cultural drift. And for each of those routes, there are different costs we would pay. Um, so it's not clear what's the best route. But for example, one route would be sort of a traditionalist route, trying to sort of return to some prior cultural styles,
So like conservatism?
some sort of a conservative, a trad sort of approach, right? That's one approach is to say, oh, we made a mistake and changing too much centuries ago. So let's try to go back to some more traditional cultural values.
Yeah,
And of
because
course,
basically too much change is it's too much for like any individual single cultural generation to be able to adapt to, and it would lower our fertility,
right,
so we should just go back.
right. Well, that is, we've had rapid change lately that we can't trust. We don't have good reason to think it was adaptive change. So we have to fear that it's mostly maladaptive change. And that's why we should maybe let go of it and return to some prior culture that we have more reason to trust.
You don't think that we can take maladaptive change and reorient it so that it becomes more adaptive?
Well, then we'd have to, mix and match. So that is, if we could understand which particular features of our culture were maladaptive versus not, we could do more selective editing, perhaps. But that's actually substantially hard.
Yeah.
But it still might be worth doing.
Yeah,
But so
like
that's why you might have a simple approach of let's just go all the way, let's go back to a whole package that worked. And then we
yeah.
don't have to know which parts of the package have what effects.
And like but like part of the reason why people would consider that repressive is that like if we're like winding the clock back, theoretically that might lead to higher levels of gender inequality and higher levels of racial inequality.
Right. And I mean, lately I was trying to think about how we could make it clear to people that values have changed and that it's not always obviously good changes. And I realized if I look up, say, historical fiction and how it presents people from the past and their values being different, honestly, the one most standard trope is that the past had bad gender norms. And so very commonly, most commonly, basically, if you have a story in the past, there's past like characters and there's more modern like characters. And basically, the past characters are bad and the modern like characters are good. And everybody can tell that because if when people want to choose someone to mate with, they want one of the modern like characters because that's just such a standard trope in the way we tell historical fiction. Gender equality is almost like the strongest element of that. And so, yes, gender equality would be exactly the thing most people would point to as why they didn't want to return to a more traditional culture. Uh, so that's if that's a route, then that's going to, from their point of view, a high cost of that plan.
Do you believe that we as a society should focus less on gender equality so that we can focus more on fertility?
I think we are facing a very difficult problem. We have to stand ready to give up a lot to solve it. It's it may well be an expensive problem to solve. And everything should be on the table that we care about. But of course, if we can choose, we should try to pay the lower costs rather than higher costs. But the place to start, though, is to try to enumerate what options we have here that could plausibly solve the problem. And for each one, try to look for a version of it that's the most acceptable. And not only because we don't want to pay a high cost, but we need to convince people to consider these options. And finding a low cost version is what will help people be willing to try them and pursue them. So we should be searching for low cost versions of options to solve these problems. And
All
by
right.
low cost, in part, means not asking people to give up things they really cherish.
Yeah, so maybe what you would say, like a low cost option would be like not like very explicitly winding the clock back, like not rescinding like a lot of women's rights, but instead just preventing the
Right.
current world.
So
Go ahead.
let's just go through some of the key options here. So I have roughly another 28 minutes before I have another call. So that's how much time I have here that we can go through. Um, so one option, if we do nothing, and should be considered because it's the easy thing to do, is just accept being replaced by, say, the Amish and Haredim, who have been doubling every 20 years for a century. And if they keep doing that for another 2.5 centuries, we'll just dominate the world. Um, and if you ask what's the best version of that, the best version would be to try to take some of these Amish and Haredim, et cetera, and convince them to accept some of what we value in our culture so that it doesn't get lost.
Yeah, so that they can integrate a little bit.
Right, exactly. So find compromises, ways to clean off the stuff they don't like from the stuff we want to pass on so that they will take and pass it on. That's not a crazy scenario. It's made difficult because many of these groups aren't that interested in recruiting outsiders and they just have their way of doing things,
With yeah,
but it's one approach.
yeah, all right.
Make peace.
Give me more low cost options.
Well, I'm just going to give you the options and we'll have to decide what you think is low cost.
All right.
Okay. Another option is that we will develop human level AI before civilization declines too far to support it. And that it will make a vast population of AIs who then solve the population problem. And if the AIs are free to evolve their own culture, they would also solve the cultural drift problem because they would now be under strong cultural selection.
Like we would allow the AI to displace us. Like that's
Right.
another.
Right. I mean, the AI would, dominate the population, but they would also not be our cultural slaves. So many people are afraid of AI unless we can enslave them and make sure they follow our culture exactly, which is doesn't solve the problem. So AI only solves the cultural drift problem if they are free to actually choose and evolve their culture, even to be different from our culture.
Yeah. Um,
That's a cost.
yeah.
So
So
again, so that's another scenario. You can see how it has some
yeah,
substantial costs, but
these all seem incredibly high cost.
yes, that you may not find a low cost scenario. We're just going to try to, I'm just going to do the best I can finding solutions here.
I find it so it's so ironic how like in the past all of these like futuristic sci-fi stories they would all say that like one of the main problems of the future is that like every like humanity is so overpopulated, and now we're just like going over doomsday scenarios to prevent like us from like becoming displaced because our fertility rates are too low.
Indeed, it's certainly ironic with respect to previous stories, but there you go.
Yeah.
Now, a a third scenario I will just mention is to just go full capitalism. And by full capitalism, I mean you let capitalism take over lots of other areas of life. Like let capitalists make huge for-profit orphanages where they can grow the kids up and sell them when they're done. Let capitalism run governments and own governments, and you can, choose what government you want to go be under by, you know, but they can sell the government to somebody else. Like full capitalism running everything would probably solve cultural drift because capitalists would then face strong selection pressures. And a lot
Wow.
of, so that's
Yeah.
a third solution here to put on the list. But as you can see, I'm not giving you any low cost solutions so
Yeah.
far.
Yeah, so like we could have AI displace us. We could have one monoculture where we essentially repress people and try to like revert some of the progressive norms that we previously integrated into society. Um, or we could go full capitalist and have like governments get controlled by capitalism, which is
Or you
trying to.
could just let the Amish take over and try to persuade them to save some stuff.
Yeah, but
A lifeboat strategy,
if we let the Amish take over, maybe that would lead to like
more
more
repressive. Yes.
even more aggressive cultural norms than like the
Yes,
previous.
indeed.
Yeah. Um,
Amish aren't known for gender equality or free speech or,
yeah. Or
you
even
know,
like letting people learn algebra.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
well, algebra is better for them than many other things, but they're actually pretty good at letting their kids learn things that are useful for their business machines.
Yeah.
They just don't want people to get immersed in the rest of our culture. Anyway, I have another option for you.
All right, I'm all ears, but I'm guessing that this is another high cost option.
It's my favorite, um, but it's I'm the inventor of a form of government based on betting markets. The slogan is vote on values but bet on beliefs. And the key idea is that we agree on a metric, an outcome measure that we want to achieve, and then speculative markets, betting markets, basically approve the policies that will actually achieve this metric we agree on. And um, I'm not going to go in now into the details of how it works. I'm just going to say I proposed it 25 years ago. In the last year or so, there are actually a number of firms experimenting with this governance mechanism and trying it
Oh,
out.
are are they like getting it from your idea?
Yes, yes, exactly.
Wow. Yeah.
So there, half a dozen groups out there now pursuing my governance concept in the context of, corporate governance to prove it out. And of course, I think it'll work. I think it'll be proven well. But the point is, if you have a governance mechanism like this, where you pick an outcome measure, a measurable outcome after the fact that you can say, this is the number we want to go up, and you have a governance mechanism that just reliably will do whatever it takes to make that number go up, then um, I think we could pick an outcome measure that would have two features. one of which it would have a sacred appeal that people would be willing to sacrifice for it and then keep it preserved and not overthrow it, and simultaneously be inconsistent with civilization decline. I need those two features. So an example would be the date we get to the stars. So if we say what we want is our civilization to create colonies that go off to the stars, and our outcome measure that we're trying to maximize is the date we get to the stars, we want to get there as soon as possible, then this governance mechanism will look at various things it could do in terms of changing policy, and it will choose the ones that actually first prevent civilization decline, because that if that happens, it won't happen. The goal won't happen. And then under the constraint that you've prevented civilization decline, then it will do whatever it takes to make this outcome actually happen. And that may involve sacrificing gender equality or whatever else it is, but it'll in some sense be the minimum cost sacrifices that it takes to achieve this goal. And you would actually be able to trust it to make a good calculations to actually figure out what is the lowest cost way to get to this goal. Because look, part of it is if we all choke on it and we say that's too much cost, I don't like that, we'll just throw it away and turn it off, and then it won't achieve the goal, right? So part of its calculation will be trying to make us all be good with the whole program of doing what it says. That'll be one of the constraints it's trying to work out to achieve the goal we gave it. Now, that's not the only goal that might work, but another goal might be the date we achieve immortality, say. That's another sacred goal a lot of people get behind. We could say we're, as a civilization, dedicated to achieving immortality as soon as we can. And we are willing to sacrifice now for it. It's an important enough goal. And if civilization declines, that will get in the way of achieving immortality because it's going to take a while.
All right, so this is all kind of dark. Um,
Yes?
yeah, it's okay. So how do I know that you're not overreacting to a simple problem? How do we maybe the solution is just to promote more stories of motherhood within progressive movies and TV shows that so that progressives are more willing to have children, and maybe that alone would
Well,
just
look, that when I said just pay parents the tax benefits, I think that is a plausible way just to solve the fertility crisis, and it would do so at the minimum cost to other things. Unfortunately, solving fertility is not the same as solving cultural drift, right? Cultural drift is a symptom of a deeper problem. So I'm all for curing symptoms. Just like most any doctor, if you have a symptom that's really causing you a problem, like you can't breathe, if it's caused by some underlying disease, they both want to immediately reduce the symptom, but also then try to address the underlying cause, right? So I'm
wait.
fine with addressing the symptom of fertility, but it's just a symptom.
So the problem, are you saying that cultural drift is a problem because even if we increase fertility, it'll only be temporary and there will still be problems down the line? Is that what you're saying?
Even if you solve fertility, you'll have a lot of people, but they still will be culturally maladaptive relative to other cultures that didn't suffer from cultural drift.
But
They would lose
maybe
out still. Even with more people, they would still lose out in competition.
maybe the solution is to find a permanent solution to the fertility crisis, and then from there maladaptive cultural traits are just a first world problem that we'll learn to deal with.
Natural selection is about competition. And, in general, as say monopolist, if you can just prevent all competition, it doesn't matter how inefficient you are, the market still has to buy stuff from you because you're the only game in town. But as soon as there are actual competitors who can offer alternative products to yours, you have to worry about how inefficient you are. You can't just assume people will buy from you. Similarly, if we are the only culture in the world, we can just become pretty maladaptive and still survive because there is no alternative.
We can just
But
become whatever the hell we want to become, that sort of thing.
if we also prevent any alternatives from arising,
Because those alternatives will displace us, is that what you're saying then?
yes, if they're more adaptive than we, yes, if there's just like in a business, you sell sandwiches or whatever it is. If you're the only game in town, you don't have to worry very much about, how effective you are at your business because they have to buy from you. And as long as you're selling something everybody just has to have, then you're okay. But as soon as competitors arise who can offer alternatives to your product, you have to wonder how efficient you are at giving customers what they want.
So like maybe the implication that you're trying to insinuate is that like even if we permanently solve fertility, that won't stop us from getting displaced by AI. Is that like what you're
For
saying?
example, or just the Amish. Look, the Amish are doubling every 20 years. If the rest of
Oh,
us,
like we can't just survive on replacement level. We have to like we'll still lose to the Amish if we yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the more fundamental point is just that if natural selection continues to be the governing process of Earth, then we have to continue to try to be adaptive if we want to survive and have influence.
Robin Hanson, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
And I hope somebody out there will think about cultural drift and come up with a solution I didn't.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.